So let's talk about a phone call that ended a war strategy. October 15, 2025, President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have what the White House calls a very productive conversation. They're planning to meet in Budapest. The diplomatic world is watching. Maybe, just maybe, Trump's personal relationship with Putin, the one critics attacked him over for years, maybe that's finally going to end this war. Peace talks, negotiations, the deal, and then Trump pulls the plug. We canceled the meeting with President Putin, Trump said from the Oval Office on October 22. It didn't feel right to meet. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get. It didn't feel right. Think about that phrase for a second. This is a man who built a career on making deals, who met with Kim Jong-un, who negotiated with everyone from Mexican presidents to Chinese premiers. And he's saying a meeting with Putin didn't feel right. But here's the thing. Trump didn't just cancel a meeting. He declared economic war. Within hours of that announcement, the United States Treasury Department dropped what energy analysts are calling the most material move to date to shut down Russia's war machine. Not by sending troops, not by imposing a no-fly zone, but by targeting the one thing Putin can't hide, can't move, and can't defend: Russia's oil industry. The targets? Rosneft and Lukoil. Russia's two largest oil companies. Together, they pump out 3.1 million barrels of oil every single day. That's not just big, that's 70% of everything Russia exports. That's 5% of all the oil on planet Earth. And overnight, Trump made it radioactive. But something else happened that same night. Something that shows this wasn't just about sanctions. 450 kilometers inside Russia, in the city of Ryazan, the night sky turned orange. Ukraine's drones, those cheap homemade drones that cost $55,000 each, hit Russia's fourth largest oil refinery. Explosions rocked the facility. Flames reached 20 meters high. 6 stories of fire tearing through a plant that processes 262,000 barrels every day. Coincidence? Let's be honest, there are no coincidences in geopolitics. So here we are. Trump canceled his meeting with Putin, then sanctioned Russia's economic jugular, and Ukraine set it on fire. All within 24 hours. And the world's oil markets, they went into shock. This is the story of how October 22, 2025 became the day everything changed. Not on the battlefield, not in peace negotiations, but in the one place Putin thought he was untouchable, his oil empire. Let's zoom in. Here's what happened, step by step. October 22, 2025. Trump is sitting in the Oval Office with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. The timing matters here. Rutte arrives right after Trump canceled the Budapest summit. And Trump he's frustrated. Every time I speak to Vladimir, I have good conversations and then they don't go anywhere, Trump says to reporters. They just don't go anywhere. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is preparing the announcement, and when it drops, it's sweeping. The United States Treasury designates 2 companies, Open Joint Stock Company, Rosneft Oil Company, and Lukoil OAO, plus 30 subsidiaries. The sanctions aren't subtle. These are blocking sanctions. Asset freezes in the United States. No United States entities can do business with them. And here's the part that makes it devastating. Any foreign bank that helps these companies process transactions risks getting cut off from the United States financial system. That last part, that's the weapon. Because Russian oil doesn't flow through pipelines alone, it flows through banks, through insurance companies, through shipping registries. And if helping Rosneft means you can't access dollars, well, suddenly, Russian oil becomes a problem nobody wants to touch. Bessent's statement is direct. Given President Putin's refusal to end this senseless war, Treasury is sanctioning Russia's 2 largest oil companies that fund the Kremlin's war machine. Now is the time to stop the killing and for an immediate ceasefire. Let's talk about what this actually means in concrete terms. Rosneft produces 5.2 million barrels of oil per day. That's 40% of everything Russia pumps out of the ground. It's state-controlled, meaning the Kremlin directly owns it. This isn't some private company Putin can distance himself from. This is Putin's company. Lukoil produces 1.6 million barrels per day. It's Russia's largest non-state enterprise, but it's so big that it's basically an extension of the state anyway. Together with Rosneft, these 2 companies are responsible for almost half of Russia's total oil production. But here's where it gets really interesting. The United States had already sanctioned Russia's 3rd and 4th largest oil producers back in January, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas. Those sanctions didn't stop the war. Putin found workarounds, prices adjusted, life went on. So why is this different? Because now, more than 80% of Russia's liquid hydrocarbon production is under United States sanctions. You can work around losing 20%. You can even manage losing 50% if you're creative. But 80%? That's not a workaround problem. That's an existential threat to your economy. And this wasn't just America acting alone. 7 days earlier, October 15, the United Kingdom hit Rosneft and Lukoil with asset freezes. And on the same day Trump announced his sanctions, the European Union rolled out its 19th sanctions package, including a full transaction ban on Rosneft. This was coordinated. The West moved as one. The sanctions take full effect on November 21, 2025. But the market didn't wait. October 23, markets open and chaos. West Texas Intermediate crude, that's the United States oil benchmark, jumps 5.6% in a single day. It closes at $61.79 per barrel. That's a gain of $3.29. Brent crude, the international benchmark, spikes 5.43% to $65.99, up $3.40. That's the biggest one-day oil jump in more than 4 months. Not since the Israel-Iran conflict in June had oil moved like this. Heating oil led the surge, up 6.8%, because it's October. Winter is coming. And suddenly, the world's energy traders are doing the math on what happens if 3.1 million barrels per day of Russian oil has nowhere to go. But the real shockwaves hit Asia. China, Russia's biggest oil customer, made a decision that stunned the markets. Chinese state oil companies suspended purchases of seaborne Russian oil, PetroChina, Sinopec, Sinuk, Genhua Oil, all the big names, halted their short-term deals with Rosneft and Lukoil. Why? Compliance concerns. They couldn't risk getting cut off from United States financial systems. China imports 2 million barrels per day from Russia. That's 20% of all the crude oil flowing into the world's second largest economy. And overnight, the tap turned off. Then there's India. And India's position is complicated. India had already been hit with 50% tariffs. Yes, 50%, because Trump was punishing them for buying Russian oil in the first place. Back in August, Trump imposed a 25% reciprocal tariff, then added another 25% secondary tariff as a penalty for fueling Russia's war machine. Modi's government pushed back, saying they were just trying to keep energy costs down for 1.4 billion people. But now, with Rosneft and Lukoil sanctioned, Indian refiners started panicking. Reliance Industries, India's largest private refiner, announced it would adapt refinery operations to meet compliance requirements. Translation, we're cutting Russian oil. Multiple other refiners simply paused all imports, waiting for guidance from their government. Here's the scale of that decision. India imports 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day from Russia. That's 30 to 40% of all Russian oil exports. If India stops buying, Russia loses its second biggest customer. And here's the twist. 5 of India's major refiners placed 0 orders for Russian crude for December. Usually, those deals are locked in by the 10th of the month. This time, nothing. Meanwhile, in Russia itself, the stock market took the hit. Lukoil shares dropped 9.4%. Rosneft fell 7%. And while Putin's spokesperson claimed Russia had developed a strong immunity to Western restrictions, the numbers told a different story. But let's step back to that fire in Ryazan. Same night as Trump's announcement, October 23, Ukrainian drones struck the Ryazan oil refinery. Multiple explosions, massive fires spreading across the facility, flames visible from kilometers away, lighting up the night sky like some apocalyptic scene. The refinery processes 262,000 barrels per day. In 2024, it produced 2.2 million tons of gasoline, 3.4 million tons of diesel, 4.3 million tons of fuel oil, and 1 million tons of jet fuel. This isn't some small operation. This is critical infrastructure for Moscow and the surrounding regions. And it's more than 450 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Think about that. Ukrainian drones, built in scattered workshops, costing $55,000 each, are striking targets the distance from Washington District of Columbia to Boston, and they're setting them on fire. That wasn't the only strike. Ukraine also hit an artenode.com Ammunition depot near Veluki in Belgorod Oblast, secondary explosions, munitions detonating. And over the week of October 17 to 23, Ukrainian forces hit 12 different energy-related targets across Russia. This wasn't random. This was a campaign timed to coincide with Trump's economic pressure. Let that sink in. Let's talk about the people making these decisions. Because this isn't about abstract policy. It's about calculations, pressure, and pride. Start with Trump. For 9 months, from January to October 2025, Trump maintained all of Biden's sanctions on Russia, but didn't add any new ones. He was trying the personal approach. He met with Putin in Anchorage, Alaska back in August. The photos showed them shaking hands, smiling. Trump talked about Putin being a strong leader and how they had a very productive call. But something shifted. Maybe it was the continued Russian bombardment of Ukrainian cities. Maybe it was pressure from Congress, NATO allies. Or maybe, and this feels closer to the truth, maybe Trump realized Putin was playing him. Those productive conversations weren't going anywhere because Putin never intended them to. So Trump did what Trump does when he feels disrespected. He hit back hard. And the thing is, this wasn't impulsive. The coordination with the United Kingdom and European Union shows planning. Britain moved first on October 15. That gave the world a week to see the signal. Then Trump and the European Union hit simultaneously. This was choreographed. Now let's talk about Putin. His response was predictable but revealing. He went on television and said the sanctions would have little impact on Russia's economy. He warned that they'd drive up global oil prices, which would hurt American consumers, playing to Trump's domestic political concerns. And he said, no self-respecting country ever does anything under pressure. But here's what he didn't say, how Russia would actually replace the lost revenue. Because Russia's 2025 budget counted on oil revenues of 28 trillion rubles. That's about $294 billion. And for 2026, they're projecting oil revenues will drop to 8.9 trillion rubles. That's less than a third. Oil and gas revenues make up about 25% of Russia's federal budget. Lose that, and you're not just cutting military spending, you're cutting everything. Pensions, infrastructure, public services. And in an authoritarian system, that kind of economic pain creates political instability. Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president, now deputy chairman of the Security Council, was more direct. He posted on Telegram, "The United States of America is our adversary, and their loquacious peacemaker has now fully taken up the path of war with Russia." That word adversary, that's not diplomatic language. That's a declaration. Then there's Narendra Modi. India's prime minister is caught in an impossible position. His country needs cheap energy to fuel economic growth for 1.4 billion people. Russian oil, sold at a discount, has been a windfall. India went from importing almost nothing from Russia before the war to importing 36% of its crude from Moscow. But now Trump is saying, stop buying Russian oil or pay 50% tariffs on everything you sell to the United States. And India exports $87 billion in goods to the United States annually: pharmaceuticals, smartphones, clothing. A 50% tariff doesn't just hurt margins. It destroys entire supply chains. Trump claims Modi promised to stop buying Russian oil. Modi's government hasn't confirmed that. What they have said is that their imports are based on market factors and necessary for energy security. That's diplomatic speak for, we'll see. And finally, there's Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine's president has been pushing for exactly this kind of pressure for years. He's argued that Russia's oil revenues are what keep the war going, that every barrel sold is another missile fired at Kyiv. Now, finally, the West is listening. But Zelensky knows this isn't enough. He's also calling for long-range missiles, for permission to strike deeper into Russia, for frozen Russian assets to be used to buy weapons. Because sanctions are great, but Ukraine still needs to win on the battlefield. These four leaders, Trump, Putin, Modi, Zelensky, they're all making bets. And the stakes? Hundreds of billions of dollars, millions of lives, the future of the global energy system. Let's follow the money, because that's where this gets really interesting. Russia's economy isn't complicated. It's an oil state, period. About 40% of federal revenue comes from oil and gas exports. The government's entire budget is built around a specific price per barrel and a specific export volume. Change either of those, and the math breaks. Here's the baseline. Russia produces about 10 million barrels of oil per day. Of that, they export roughly 5 million barrels. Rosneft and Lukoil account for 3.1 million barrels of those exports. So we're talking about 62% of Russia's export capacity now under sanction. At current prices, let's say $70 per barrel. That's $217 million per day in revenue. Over a year, $79 billion. Just from these two companies. But it's not just about stopping the oil. It's about forcing Russia to sell at a massive discount. Because the oil still exists. Russia still needs to sell it. But now, every buyer is taking a risk. So they demand lower prices. Instead of selling at $70, Russia might have to settle for $55. That $15 per barrel discount across 3.1 million barrels, that's $46.5 million in lost revenue every single day. Now multiply that across a year. That's $17 billion in lost annual revenue. And that's assuming Russia can even sell all of it. Energy analysts are predicting Russian exports could fall by 700,000 barrels per day. That's another $49 million in daily revenue gone. Add it up. Russia could be looking at $35 billion in lost oil revenue annually, maybe more. And this comes at the worst possible time for Russia's war effort. The military is burning through equipment faster than factories can replace it. Casualty numbers are mounting. Some estimates put Russian military deaths at over 600,000 since the invasion began. The economy has shifted to a wartime footing, which means consumer goods are scarce and inflation is rising. Russia's 2026 budget is already tight. They're projecting 40 trillion rubles in total revenue. If oil revenues drop from 28 trillion to 8.9 trillion as forecasted, that's a 19 trillion ruble hole. And you can't just print your way out of that without triggering hyperinflation. So Putin has choices, none of them good. He can cut military spending, but that means losing the war. He can cut social spending, but that risks domestic unrest. Or he can raid Russia's sovereign wealth fund, which is already being drained to cover budget shortfalls. Meanwhile, the sanctions are hitting Russia's international energy projects. Rosneft owns a stake in one of India's biggest refineries, Nyara Energy. It controls 30% of Egypt's offshore Zohr gas project. It technically owns a majority stake in Germany's Schwedt oil refinery, though Germany seized control after the invasion. All of those assets, now potentially worthless, because no Western company wants to partner with a sanctioned entity. No Western bank wants to process transactions. No Western insurer wants to cover shipments. Lukoil's even more exposed internationally. It has major exploration projects in Iraq, Uzbekistan, Congo, and Mexico. It owns stakes in refineries in the Netherlands, Romania, Italy, and Bulgaria. All of that is now at risk. And here's the thing about sanctions. They cascade. You don't just lose the direct business. You lose the suppliers who don't want to risk secondary sanctions. You lose the logistics companies. You lose the service providers. Entire ecosystems collapse. This isn't a blockade. It's economic strangulation. Now let's step back and look at what this actually means strategically. First, coordination. For the first time in Trump's presidency, across both terms, we're seeing genuine alignment with European allies on Russia. The United Kingdom moved first. The United States followed. The European Union joined the same day. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. And it's significant because Trump has spent years criticizing NATO, questioning European commitment, and pursuing unilateral deals. But on October 22, Trump let NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte sit next to him as he announced sanctions. The symbolism matters. It says we're unified. But here's the question. Is this unity real or is it temporary? Because Russia has gotten very, very good at evading sanctions. After previous rounds of sanctions, Russia created a shadow fleet of oil tankers, essentially third-party intermediaries that mask who actually owns the oil. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, alternative currency payment systems, shell companies in Dubai and Singapore that exist only on paper. In January 2025, Biden sanctioned Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas. Those sanctions looked devastating. And then, nothing. Russia found workarounds, overhead costs went up briefly, then came back down, the oil kept flowing. So why would Rosneft and Lukoil be any different? The answer is scale. You can hide 20% of your oil exports. You can maybe hide 50% if you're clever. But 80%, that's not evasion. That's restructuring your entire economy. And there's no way to do that quietly. Plus, the United States isn't just relying on sanctions. Ukraine is physically destroying Russian refining capacity. According to analysts, Ukrainian drone strikes have knocked out about 10 to 17% of Russia's refining capacity. That's 1.1 million barrels per day that can't be processed. Think about the strategic logic here. Sanctions make it harder to sell oil. Drone strikes make it harder to refine oil. Together, they create a double squeeze. Russia can't refine what it pumps, and it can't sell what it refines. But there's a countermove available to Russia: escalation. Putin has already warned that if Ukraine gets Tomahawk cruise missiles, which the United States is reportedly considering, that would be a whole new level of escalation. And Medvedev has been even more explicit, talking about potential nuclear responses. So the West is trying to calibrate, apply enough pressure to end the war, but not so much pressure that Putin feels cornered and does something catastrophic. That's the tightrope. And nobody knows where the breaking point is. We've seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. In 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on countries supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled. Gas stations in America ran out of fuel. Lines stretched for blocks. The global economy went into recession. The lesson from 1973 was clear. Oil is a weapon. Control oil, and you control economies. Fast forward to the 1980s. The Soviet Union, Russia's predecessor, depended heavily on oil revenues. When oil prices collapsed from $35 per barrel in 1980 to $10 by 1986, the Soviet economy imploded. That collapse contributed to the end of the Cold War. Oil didn't just hurt the Soviet Union, it helped destroy it. Putin knows this history. He lived through it. He watched the Soviet Union disintegrate, partly because it couldn't sustain itself when oil revenues dried up, and he built Russia's resurgence on oil wealth. The whole system, the military, the social spending, the political stability, it's all built on oil money. So when Trump targets Russia's oil industry, he's not just attacking revenue. He's attacking the foundation of Putin's power. But here's where history offers a warning. Sanctions don't always work. They didn't stop Iran from pursuing nuclear weapons. They didn't stop North Korea from building missiles. And they didn't stop Russia in 2014 after it annexed Crimea. Why? Because authoritarian regimes can absorb pain in ways democracies can't. Putin doesn't face elections. He doesn't answer to voters. He controls the media, suppresses dissent, and blames the West for any economic suffering. In democracies, high gas prices mean losing elections. In Russia, high gas prices mean state propaganda, explaining why it's all NATO's fault. So the question isn't just, will sanctions hurt Russia? Of course they will. The question is, will they hurt Russia enough to change Putin's calculation about the war? And honestly, history suggests no. Putin has said repeatedly that Ukraine isn't just a war, it's existential for Russia. He believes Ukraine should be part of Russia, that Ukrainian independence is a historical mistake, and that losing Ukraine means losing Russia's status as a great power. You don't compromise on existential issues, which means these sanctions might not end the war, but they might do something else, make the war too expensive to sustain indefinitely. Let's bring this down to the human level, because policy is abstract until it hits real people. Imagine you're a refinery worker in Ryazan. It's October 23, 3 in the morning. You're on the night shift, monitoring the systems that process 262,000 barrels of oil every day. Everything's routine. You're checking gauges, watching temperatures, maybe drinking bad coffee from the break room, and then you hear it, that high-pitched buzz. You've heard it before, a couple of times this year, actually. It's a drone, and you know what happens next. You run, everyone runs. Because when a drone hits a refinery, the explosion can be catastrophic. Fuel storage tanks ignite, fires spread across equipment, and your job, your relatively safe, stable, well-paying job in a country where good jobs are scarce, that might disappear in the flames. The strike hits, flames shoot up 20 meters. The heat is intense even from a distance. And in the morning, when the smoke clears, you're staring at damage that might take months to repair, if it gets repaired at all. Now imagine you're a refinery manager in Mumbai. You've been buying Russian crude for 3 years because it's cheap, $15 per barrel below market price. Your margins have been strong. Your company is profitable. And you're doing exactly what your government said was legal and necessary for national energy security. Then Trump announces 50% tariffs on everything India sells to the United States. Your CEO calls an emergency meeting. The math is brutal. If you keep buying Russian oil, your company faces tariffs that wipe out all profitability. If you stop buying Russian oil, you need to find alternative suppliers, Middle Eastern crude that costs $72 per barrel instead of $57. Either way, you lose. And so do the millions of Indians who'll pay higher prices at the pump. Or imagine you're a Chinese purchasing manager at Sinopec. Your refineries need 2 million barrels per day. Yesterday, you had suppliers. Today, your government is telling you to suspend purchases because the risk of United States sanctions is too high. But your refineries can't just shut down. You need oil. Now, where do you get it? Middle East? That's more expensive. Americas? That requires new logistics. Africa, limited capacity. And every alternative adds costs that eventually get passed to consumers. And finally, imagine you're a mother in Kyiv. It's winter. Russian missiles and drones are hitting your city almost every night. Power outages are constant. Heat is scarce. Your children are scared. But you hear that Ukraine is striking back, hitting Russian oil refineries, forcing Russian leaders to choose between funding the war and keeping their own people warm. And you think, maybe this pressure will finally end it. Maybe our allies in the West are finally serious about stopping Putin. That hope, fragile as it is, that's the human element here. Because sanctions and drone strikes are abstractions until you're the worker fleeing the fire, the manager making impossible choices, the consumer paying higher prices, or the mother hoping this all ends before winter really hits. Now let's zoom out, because this isn't just about Russia and Ukraine. This is about the global energy system. Start with the price impact. When Trump announced sanctions, oil spiked 5.6%. That's $3.40 per barrel. Sounds small. But multiply that across 90 million barrels of daily global oil consumption, and you're talking about $306 million in additional daily costs every single day. For Americans, that means higher prices at the pump. For Europe, which is already dealing with energy inflation post-Ukraine invasion, it means more pain. For developing countries that import oil, it means budget pressures and potential social unrest. And here's the thing, oil markets hate uncertainty. Even if Russian oil eventually finds buyers through shadow channels, the mere existence of sanctions creates volatility. Volatility means higher prices. Higher prices mean inflation. Inflation means central banks raising interest rates. Higher rates mean slower economic growth. So Trump's sanctions on Russian oil companies don't just hurt Russia. They ripple through the entire global economy. Then there's the geopolitical shift. China and India are being forced to choose. Do we keep buying cheap Russian oil and risk United States sanctions? Or do we align with the West and pay more for our energy? For India, it's particularly painful. Modi has tried to maintain strategic autonomy, buying from Russia while staying friendly with the United States. But Trump's tariffs make that impossible. India now has to pick a side. China's calculation is different. Beijing has been building alternative financial systems specifically to avoid United States sanctions. The petro-yuan, the CIPS payment system, bilateral currency swaps, all designed to reduce dollar dependency. China could, theoretically, keep buying Russian oil using alternative payment methods. But even China paused. The Chinese state oil companies suspended purchases. Why? Because even China can't fully escape the dollar system. Too much of global trade still runs through United States banks. Getting cut off means isolation. So in the short term, China is complying. But in the long term, this accelerates China's push to build parallel financial infrastructure, which means Trump's sanctions might weaken Russia now, but strengthen China's position later. Then there's OPEC. Saudi Arabia and its allies have been trying to manage oil prices for years. They want prices high enough to fund their budgets, but low enough that they don't crash demand. Trump's sanctions throw that balance off. If Russian oil gets taken off the market, prices spike, which should be good for OPEC. But if prices spike too high, it accelerates the shift to renewable energy and electric vehicles. OPEC is watching very, very carefully. And finally, there's the impact on the war itself. The whole purpose of these sanctions is to pressure Putin to negotiate. But if history is any guide, sanctions don't end wars quickly. They grind economies down over months and years. Ukraine is hoping that economic pressure will force Putin to the table. But in the meantime, Ukrainian cities are still getting bombed. Ukrainian soldiers are still dying in trenches. And winter is coming. So the ripple effects aren't just economic, they're humanitarian, they're strategic, they're long-term shifts in how the world orders itself. And nobody knows exactly how it ends. So here we are. October 22, 2025 wasn't just a date on the calendar, it was a turning point. The day Trump stopped trying to charm Putin and started trying to bankrupt him. The day Western allies moved in unison for the first time in years. The day Ukraine's drone campaign synchronized with economic warfare. But let's be honest about what this really represents. This isn't about oil, it's about power. And more specifically, it's about how power works in the 21st century. For most of human history, power came from armies. You wanted to conquer territory, you sent soldiers, you wanted to punish an enemy, you invaded. Power was physical, visible, measurable in tanks and troops. But in the modern world, power flows through different channels: financial systems, energy markets, supply chains. The ability to cut someone off from the dollar is more devastating than the ability to cut someone off with a border. The ability to sanction someone's oil is more effective than bombing their oil fields. Trump didn't send troops into Russia. He didn't launch missiles. He made phone calls, signed an executive order, and coordinated with allies. And in doing so, he potentially struck a bigger blow against Putin's war machine than Ukraine's military has managed in 2 years of fighting. That's the evolution of power. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Economic warfare has limits. Russia is still selling oil. China might resume buying. India is weighing its options. Shadow fleets exist. Alternative payment systems are growing. And Putin remains defiant, betting he can outlast Western resolve. So the sanctions might work, or they might just be another round in an endless cycle of pressure and evasion. What is clear is that Trump made a choice. He chose confrontation over conciliation. He chose allied unity over solo deal-making. And he chose economic pressure over military escalation. Whether it works depends on factors outside his control. How much pain can the Russian economy absorb? How long will China and India comply? How cold will winter get in Ukraine? How high will oil prices go? But the bet has been made. And now we wait to see if strangling Russia's oil industry can do what 3 years of war couldn't: end the killing. Because in the end, that's what this is about. Not abstract geopolitics, not strategic positioning, but whether Ukrainian mothers can sleep without fearing missiles, whether Russian soldiers stop dying in trenches, whether the world can step back from the edge. Trump's sanctions won't answer those questions alone. But they're the most serious attempt yet to force an answer. And that fire in Ryazan, that orange glow lighting up the night sky 450 kilometers inside Russia, that's not just a refinery burning. That's a message from Ukraine to Russia, from the West to Putin. The message is simple: your oil money won't save you anymore. Now the question is whether Putin is listening.